Okay. And Nick, are you with us?
Yes, I am. Hopefully you have good sound and vision, everyone.
Oh, it sounds wonderful. Thank you, sir.
Well, I will jump straight in then. And first of all, I should make a little, well, first of all, welcome everyone. And thank you very much for turning up. I see on top of the screen a small but very distinguished group of people whose names I recognize from various open and closed lists on this subject. So I think there are some very interesting players here today. Welcome. I'm actually speaking to you from Tucson in the great state of Arizona. I've lived in the US since 2012, so I'm not actually in the UK. So with that out of the way, first of all, a disclaimer and an excuse. I am not a scientist. I am a former civilian employee of the British government at the Ministry of Defense. So the science parts of a lot of this will go way over my head, I'm afraid. I know what I don't know. But what I am going to aim to do today, and I think I've got about an hour, and then throw it over to questions, but we'll see. What I'm going to aim to do today is maybe give a little overview of the UFO phenomenon, but with particular reference to some of the things going on over in the last 3 years here in the US Navy sightings, AATIP, ORSAP, Senate Intelligence Committee interest, those sorts of things. And what I'm going to try and do, a lot of you will be very familiar with the facts of this, but hopefully in telling the story, I will be able to contextualize it and give, I hope, a sort of insider's view on how government views this subject. And all you scientists may say, no, you're getting it completely wrong. And absolutely, that's your right. And we can get into that in the Q&A. But I will just tell you how I view this coming from a government background. Before I go on, how is the sound and vision doing on that? All good?
Yeah, Nick, you sound wonderful. Thank you.
Oh, great.
Yeah.
Fabulous. Well, I will press on. And greetings to everyone, as I say. And I see, I caught the tail end, and greetings particularly to Ronald. I think you're going to be mentioned in this first little anecdote that I tell. Despite not being a scientist, I do have a sort of layperson's interest in advanced theoretical physics, exotic propulsion systems, etc. And I attended back in, gosh, I think it was January 2001, a sort of international field propulsion. Good, yes, you know the one, the International Field Propulsion Conference held at, I think it was University of Sussex in Brighton, organized by Ron Ennis, was it, I think? Graham Ennis. And Ronald was there, and Hal Puthoff was there, and 2 or 3 of the, I mean, maybe some other people here today were present, 2 or 3 of the people who authored some of the 38 papers produced under the AATIP/ORSAP contract were there as well. I'm not sure whether I'm supposed to name them even now, but I think for those that want, it's a very interesting thing. I looked the other day, actually. It's very hard to dig out the agenda for that field propulsion conference and the list of attendees, but I did find it. I think it is out there. There is quite an overlap, as I say, with the authorship of the 38 AATIP papers. So that's an interesting little part of this, a story that perhaps has not yet been told. And if anyone wants that, I'm sure I can track down again the hyperlinks to it. But my recollection was that there were, shall we say, an awful lot of people from not just the scientific community, but from government, military, and intelligence, all, and I'm including myself in this group, somewhat sheepishly looking down at our shoes and saying, oh, yes, I'm only here in a private capacity, you understand. And everyone nodding back and saying, oh, yes, me too, me too. So that that particular field propulsion conference, I think, although it was now, what, 21 years ago, actually this month, sowed some interesting seeds, some of which are germinating and still germinating today. So with that little anecdote out of the way, I'll jump straight in. I worked for the Ministry of Defence in the UK for 21 years. I'm a civilian employee. They move you around every 3 or 4 years on level transfer or hopefully promotion if you do well. And I did, I think, 5, 6, 7 different jobs, including some secondments in the course of all this. I'm best known for a posting that I held between 1991 and 1994, when I was assigned to a Ministry of Defence division called Secretariat Air Staff. And obviously that's meaningless to people outside of the system. So in colloquial, does what it says on the tin terms, when I talk about this and when the media talk about this, they tend to use phrases like UFO desk, UFO program, UFO project. But suffice to say, part of my job was to research and investigate the UFO phenomenon, not because we had any corporate belief in extraterrestrial life, but simply as part and parcel of the need and desire to know about anything going on in the United Kingdom's air defense region. Now, this was a program that a portfolio, whatever you want to call it, that goes back, frankly, to the Second World War and the reports of the so-called Foo Fighters, post-World War II, the ghost rocket sightings from Scandinavia, the flying saucer sightings, morphing into the modern UFO phenomenon as we describe it today. And a lot of this, the MOD looked at this on an ad hoc basis when it had sightings, particularly from its own people, pilots, radar operators. But formally doing this, kind of sort of trying to constitute it into a formal body of work with a methodology, etc., really goes back to 1953. And we had, I mean, there's not sufficient time to go into the history of this, and the history of this is quite dry, but it's in true British civil service fashion. It's littered with marvelous sounding committee names, such as the Flying Saucer Working Party, and some of the great pioneers of the early days, like R.V. Jones, had a role in this sort of work. But from 1953 onward, this was formally constituted, and I was fortunate enough to be parachuted into this position in 1991, not because I had any interest or knowledge or belief of this, but simply good old-fashioned British civil service practice. It was luck. I happened to be due for a move at the precise moment that this vacancy had cropped up. I had worked with the manager before when I was seconded into the Air Force operations room of the Joint Operations Center during the first Gulf War, the Persian Gulf War. So I'd worked for this person before, and he said, look, I know you're looking for a move. I've got a vacancy coming up. Do you want the job? And I said, yes, please. What is it? And he said, well, amongst other things, UFOs. So that's what I did. And as I mentioned, I'm not a scientist. I was responsible for the handling of this topic for the ministry. So when defense ministers, whether it was the Secretary of Defense or the junior ministers, as we called them, which I always think's a little bit of a misnomer, we were quaking in our boots if ever we saw a junior minister and had to brief them, which was pretty scary. So I was responsible for drafting the advice that would go up to defense ministers. I was responsible for doing the investigations, whether they came from the public or our own people, whoever. I was responsible for handling the public correspondence on this, drafting responses to any questions asked in Parliament, which again would have to be formally answered, of course, by Secretary of Defense or the other defense ministers. And I also had to draft the lines that the press office would use when we got media inquiries about all this.
So now, Nick, I'm sorry. Let me do a screen share and put your slideshow up.
Oh, okay.
And Mark is telling me that it will show you at the same time. So let me do that. I should apologize for interrupting you, sir.
No problem. Okay. Now, can I advance those slides or?
No, actually you can't, but if you say next.
Oh, okay. Well, let's go from here. And in case anyone thinks that's a typo, next, please. Us Brits spell it with a C. So there you go. Next, please. And that's, oh gosh, me with black hair. That's one of the few surviving pictures of me actually in the office where we did this. And interesting little story about this, particularly with that story in the news, what was it, yesterday, about the guy who turned up at the White House with his briefing notes. Just to let you know, this is an official photo. No personal cameras are allowed in Ministry of Defense main building, headquarters on Whitehall. No personal cameras or photography at all, of course. That was a photograph posed for our house magazine called Focus, and our branch security officer had to be present at all times to check that nothing classified was out on the desk in sight to any of the people coming in to run this article and do this photo, and to check that nothing could be picked up in the background. So there you go. Is this working well for people, by the way, with the presentation and me talking? Okay, all good. So let me just press on for a moment. I'll leave that slide up for a moment until I say next. So my job was to research and investigate all this, but I was ably assisted by the deep specialists who could tell me all the things I didn't know. So when I wanted radar advice, I could go to the Air Force experts on that. When I wanted scientific and technical advice, there were various people in the defense intelligence staff who could advise on that. And when I wanted imagery analysis on photos and videos, again, we had specialists both in the defense intelligence staff and in the wider intelligence community whose resources and capabilities we could call on for that. And just to give you a very quick headline, I suppose, conclusion of all that, and this is just broad brush figures, but essentially 80% of these sightings we could explain with a fairly high degree of confidence as misidentifications of ordinary objects or phenomena, all the usual ones: aircraft lights, meteors, fire lanterns, etc., etc. 15% probably insufficient data to make a firm assessment, 5% unexplained. Important to stress, as we always do, unexplained does not mean extraterrestrial spacecraft, but neither did we rule out that possibility. It simply means that after an investigation, we couldn't determine it. Could be something, could be nothing. Let's go to the next slide. One of the big issues in my time, but much more so in recent years, was the whole issue of secret prototype aircraft and drones. And of course, there's a, shall we say, a sort of gray area between that and the UFO phenomenon. And some people say that some of these UFOs are misperceived as black projects. Others say that governments sometimes talk up UFOs because they'd far rather the media speculate and the Russian and Chinese defense attaché speculate about UFOs and see stories about UFOs than see stories about cutting-edge military technologies. But this is a real photograph of a real thing. It's Tyrannus, named after the Celtic god of thunder. A UAV, British, hurrah. And it's quite obviously, they're self-evidently playing to the flying saucer in a hangar meme at this event from the sort of official unveiling of a prototype of this. And bear in mind with all of this, of course, the stuff they show you is the stuff they want you to see. As I often say, it's a little bit like the magician waving the arm around with the magic wand, drawing your attention when arguably the interesting and important things are going on up the sleeve of the other hand behind his back. So this is the sort of stuff they're showing in a world where there are things out there flying, depending on which aviation journalist you talk to, sort of 5, 10, 15, 20 years ahead of time. You know, what else is out there? And Ronald will probably know, as will many people on this presentation, and some of the deep specialists who are here. Just as an example, I think it would stagger most people to know just how far back the roots of stealth technology, for example, actually go. But next slide, please. FCAV. This is, I put, sometimes when I go to UFO conferences, I put these sorts of things up. I put up the last slide, and I used to ask it as a quiz question. I said, what sci-fi movie does that come from? People were shouting out their guesses, and I said, no, actually, it's real, and it's British. But this one, Future Combat Air Vehicle, was to have been an Anglo-French program. This and the previous photograph were taken off the Ministry of Defense website and the public-facing bit. I'm not a whistleblower of any kind. This is a completely unclassified presentation, and any material that I show is taken from public-facing websites and is completely unclassified. But this is a sort of example of what they're putting out there for people to see. This was to have been, as I say, an Anglo-French program. I think it has been scrapped and superseded by other things now, but and this is an artist's impression, of course, but it's just to give you an idea of the sort of things that people are thinking about right now. And so that's why I say there's a blurry line, a thin line, a gray area between the UFO mystery and the sort of black programs area. Next slide, please. Well, let's get into, let's fast forward. We can go back to my Ministry of Defense time and the UFO work in Q&A if you'd like, but I think it's very important to bring this up to date and to contextualize, really, I suppose, the events of the last 3 years. Nobody on this list, and few people, I would say, in the wider public are unaware of this story, these 3 videos, and this is just a still. I don't have the video set up, but you've all seen them, I'm sure, and if not, they're out there freely available on the internet. The 3 videos that we have of US Navy jets, F-18 Super Hornets, encountering something. And the New York Times put this on the front page on December 16th, 2017. So this and the associated story of the AATIP program, which we're going to get into a little, really, I think, has changed people's perceptions of the UFO phenomenon. And of course, we are just almost literally only days past the 3rd anniversary of that New York Times story, which was quickly followed by the Washington Post, Politico, CBS, NBC, ABC, Fox, CNN, everyone, basically. And this is not a political issue in that sense, though we will get into a little bit of some of the players a little later. But next slide, please. Associated, I hope you like my pun there, associated with the release of these Navy videos, and some of the pilots and weapons systems people and radar operators have gone on the record. David Fravor, for example, his famous quote where he says, "I don't know what it was, but I want to fly one." And one can hear the audio. There's audio on I think 2 of the 3 video clips. And when these highly trained, highly experienced alpha male and female pilots get overexcited about this, I mean, it's telling, I suppose, in and of itself. But associated with this was the revelation that despite years of denial, the Pentagon had a program. You see, over 3 years ago, if you'd been a journalist and you'd picked up the phone and spoken to someone at Department of Defense Public Affairs and asked about UFOs, you would have received the answer, nobody's interested and we don't have any programs looking into this. And then the New York Times broke this story that there was this program called AATIP, Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program. No mention of UFOs in the title. And as we'll see, there is a lot of debate about what they actually did. And even the Department of Defense itself has openly and verifiably flip-flopped on exactly what the role of AATIP was. Luis Elizondo, the career intelligence officer most normally associated with this program, has gone on the record and spoken about this. He was started off in the US Army, transferred over to the Defense Intelligence Agency, and then, like a lot of people, I don't know if any of you followed and remembered the government inquiry into the death of the British weapons scientist. Gosh, the name slips my memory for a moment. Anyway, the weapons scientist. When they did the government inquiry into that, one of the most difficult questions was the fundamental one. Well, who did he work for? And anything in the shadowy world of intelligence, it's not quite as simple a question as it might sound, because it's constant sort of secondments and special projects, deployments, etc. But anyway, next slide, please. A lot of the work of AATIP was put out into the private sector, and Bigelow Aerospace got most of this work. This is one of their logos. So again, a lot of conspiracy theories about precisely why this work was put out into the private sector. Some people saying, of course, it maybe makes congressional oversight a little bit more difficult. Maybe it makes Freedom of Information Act requests a little bit more difficult, because in addition to the exemptions covering various defense and intelligence matters, you can also deploy in parallel or in addition the exemption that applies to commercially proprietary material and the activities of the private sector. But the contractual solicitation document is one of the few pieces of paperwork about AATIP that is actually out there. And again, I think George Knapp, who has been quite close to Robert Bigelow and some of the other players, has published that, and it's now been picked up by other media outlets. But the contractual solicitation documentation for this program is out there. So you can read, for example, the names of the contracting officer, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm not going to get into the whole complicated business of how, with these sorts of fairly advanced technical intelligence programs, government keeps oversight of all of this and keeps the contractors on track, on time and on target, as we would say. But I think some people would say it's occasionally rather difficult, because I mean, we're talking about such a deep specialist world that arguably only half a dozen people in the world know a deep specialist enough to say push back if there's any, I don't know what you call it, contractual drift, so to speak. But let's press on. Next slide, please. Okay, those 3 videos we've seen, and I'm not going to quote people in the UFO community, interesting though many of them are. For these next few slides, I just want to exclusively quote the official statements that have come out of either US Navy or Department of Defense, just so that we get on all this on record. And I have no difficulty, all this presentation, Tim, you feel free to share this in perpetuity with anyone here, and anyone following this either now live or later on YouTube. I have no problem with this being put up, just to get it on the record. And this is these are the official statements that the US Navy, or some of the statements that they've given, and you'll notice that they talk about intrusions on a regular basis. And so it's important to say that all of this official interest in UFOs, or whatever terminology we use, is not because of 3 incidents. It's because of an ongoing series of incursions into restricted military airspace. And because of the time constraints, I'm not going to read these slides verbatim, but people can see them up there, and they can dip back into them afterwards. But notice in the quote that they gave to the Washington Post, their mention of the word intention. What intention implies a deliberation. I mean, it implies something over and above a phenomenon. It implies an intelligence, whether it's terrestrial or something else. So the important part of that quote to the Post, I think, was the word intention. And it's also important, I don't have a slide for this, but it's important in understanding how government and the military and the intelligence community view this phenomenon. A lot of people say, oh, this is all very negative. Everyone's talking up the threat. Well, yes, absolutely. In that community, threat is defined through an equation. And that equation is said to be capability times intent. In other words, whether there's a threat or not is a derivative of capability and intent. The data that we have on UFOs seems to imply an impressive capability. The intent remains unknown, as evidenced by that statement to the Post. And of course, in any equation, if one of the factors is unknown, you can't really solve it. So that's why we say we don't really know if there's a threat. But the government position tends to be, it's better to assume there's a threat and be relieved if one does not materialize, than have it the other way around and assume there's no threat and get caught out if one suddenly appears. So next slide, please. Here's another one. It's been a lot of as I mentioned, flip-flopping on what AATIP actually did. But Stephen Greenstreet at the New York Post managed to get this statement from a US Navy spokesperson, Joseph Gradisher, I believe. And it said, yes, AATIP did pursue research and investigation into unidentified aerial phenomena. Next slide, please. Oh, yeah, before we get into that, actually, if we could go back to the previous one. I just want to say a word or two about terminology. We in the Ministry of Defense did not invent the term UAP, unidentified aerial phenomena. It had been around for years and years. But in the early 90s, we began to adopt it, not for the media and the public, but in our internal policy discussions. And the British government has now disclosed, declassified and released about 60,000 pages of UFO documents, most of them not particularly interesting at all, some of them extremely interesting, and some of them previously at a fairly high classification. The most interesting documents are the policy discussions where you will see the term UAP used. And the reason we were using it was to try to reframe the debate about the phenomenon internally, not with the media and the public, as I say, but whether it was to get funding for studies into this or whether it was to get engagement, meaningful engagement from senior stakeholders, whether it's defense ministers, service chiefs, senior government scientists, whoever it might be. You won't get their engagement if you say to them, I'd like to talk to the boss about flying saucers or even UFOs. But if you reframe this as a defense and national security issue, or perhaps even as a science problem, you might get that engagement. And that's why we did it. And it's interesting, I think it was Joseph Gradisher, the US Navy spokesperson I mentioned a moment or two ago, who did say in one of his briefings, and that's a term, UAP, that we borrowed from the British government. So yeah, we did that. Next, please. I suppose this gets to the heart of the matter. I mean, what are we dealing with here? With those 3 Navy videos, which, by the way, originally there was some doubt about their provenance. One of them turned up years ago on the server of a German video company, then turned up on a popular UFO and conspiracy discussion forum above top secret. 2 of these videos were put out by a private group called the To the Stars Academy of Arts and Sciences, headed up by Tom DeLonge, but up until a few weeks ago with some other interesting people like Luis Elizondo, Christopher Mellon, Steve Justice attached to it too. It took some while, but eventually the Department of Defense put these 3 videos up on its website themselves and issued a press release. I think it was April 27th, 2020, it was, I believe, where DOD finally put the 3 videos up themselves and said, just to clear up the confusion, yes, these are US Navy videos, and yes, the phenomenon characterized therein remain characterized as unidentified. And in a little, I suppose, dig at some of the people involved, they referred to the previous releases as having been unauthorized, quote unquote. But the 3 videos are now up on US government websites with an admission that they are genuine. So there's no doubt about that. So look, what are we dealing with here? Skeptics will tell you it's the first option, combination of misperception, radar anomalies, forward-looking infrared camera anomalies, etc. Let me fast forward. I'll come back to the second option. But some people say, well, it's just terrestrial tech. Maybe it's our own tech being blind tested on the fleet. And these blind tests are the only way to see how people will respond, radar operators, pilots. It's the only way to see how they'll respond in real world scenarios. You can't tell someone, we're going to be testing our new toys. They're quite stealthy, so look carefully. And that's no good. You've just got to run it as a blind test and see, are we going to detect it at all? If we do, are we going to assess it as a solid return that you need to take action on? Or are you going to write it off as a glitch? If you decide to take action, what action? Are you scrambling jets? How quickly can they get there? Et cetera, et cetera. So one of the theories is that this is just a different part, left hand, right hand. And my goodness, of course, with all these highly classified, deeply compartmentalized programs, there's an awful lot of left hand, right hand, and people working in silos, and rightly so. I mean, on those sorts of programs. So could it be our own tech? Could it be Russia or China? Could it be non-state actor? And by that, I mean, I suppose people like Elon Musk or Yuri Milner or Richard Branson or whoever. Let me go back to the second option I put up there. I don't want to go into too much detail about this, but it has crossed some people's minds that much of what's gone on in the last 3 years could be some sort of intelligence operation. Very often in the intelligence world, you try to hide a capability you have, but sometimes conversely, you try to talk up a capability you don't have, or you try to sow confusion or tie up resources. And one of the least talked about theories of all this is that this is a narrative that has somehow been put together to, I suppose, try and bring about a certain outcome. Because make no mistake about it, in Russia and China and elsewhere, people in leadership positions will be turning to their subject matter experts and saying, what the heck's going on with the US at the moment with all this UFO stuff? So that's another option. And the sixth option, of course, is that it's something else, possibly something extraterrestrial, but all sorts of people have their own theories, time travelers from the future, interdimensional intrusion, demonic manifestation, or something that we simply can't characterize, something that we have maybe neither the language nor the conceptual awareness at the moment to understand, let alone put into words. As Sir Martin Rees, the Astronomer Royal, I think, once said, and I'm probably misquoting him, hopefully I'm not misattributing it, but he said, well, some of these concepts, it might be like trying to explain quantum physics to chimpanzees. So maybe some of this is something we can't even understand. Next slide, please. Here's another US Navy. Oh yes, I've done that one. That's they put that up on their April 27th, 2020 press announcement, confirming that the position is still unidentified. Next, please. That is a long-winded way of saying unidentified, and we're not going to speculate about all this. Next slide, please. This is an important one, I think. This is where hopefully my knowledge of the system will help people get a handle on this. It's one thing to say, I don't know, but we know, as I'll get on in a moment to explain, there have been congressional briefings on this. You don't go into a congressional briefing and simply say, Senator, I don't know, and pack up your notes and walk out of it again, because someone's going to stop you and say, well, wait a minute. You may not know, but what is, and there's the phrase that certainly in the UK we used to use, probably widely used, but you get the concept. Somewhere in the system, there's going to be a best current assessment. And probably what they will do is they will run through the 6 or so theories about all this that I put up in the previous slide, and they will assign to them a probability. And years ago, the CIA, you can find it on the CIA library website somewhere. They a very famous paper called something like Estimative Probability. And this arose out of CIA people giving classified briefings where they used loose language like likely or probable or possible. Oh, it's possible that the Viet Cong have this. It's probable that this is an airstrip in the jungle. And of course, the people getting the briefing, a lot of them came out of the brief with different interpretations of what had been said. Oh, but he said it was possible this was an airstrip. Or, well, he said it was probable that this was, something or the other. And we will not go political with this, but I'm sure I don't have to remind you in more recent years about the debate on whether Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction, where the position of the British government was that the intelligence was, quote, sporadic and patchy, unquote. But the politicians taking that raw intelligence either misunderstood it and or misrepresented it into a certainty. But that's a different presentation and not one that I will ever give. So somewhere in the system, there is a best current assessment of those 3 videos and the phenomenon more generally. And interestingly, there's a new media outlet called The Debrief, which has, shall I put it, some close ties with some of the people involved with this. And very interesting article ran just before Christmas. Well, I think it was December 2nd or 3rd, something like that. And clearly some people involved with this let it be known that they had not ruled out the extraterrestrial hypothesis. So make of that what you will. But as I say, in the system somewhere, there'll be a best current assessment. When I followed up on that and I said to a DoD spokesperson, look, I get that you characterize this as unidentified, but do you have a best current assessment or something, the same thing under a different name? And if so, can you release it? Not only did they not release it, but they would neither confirm nor deny that they had a best current assessment. But believe me when I tell you, they do. Because that's just the way it works. Because somewhere the president, the senators will say, well, I tell you what, I'm going to put you on the spot. Next slide, please. One of the more interesting Freedom of Information Act requests on all of this said that, yes, in Office of Naval Intelligence, it was ascertained that they had certain briefing slides classified top secret and a video classified secret that may either be different versions of the 3 videos we've seen, either different longer versions perhaps, Every story has a beginning, a middle, and an end. Arguably, the videos that we've seen are just the middle. So they may be longer. It may be that there's more telemetry data up there. You see some things from the head-up display. Maybe there's more of that, or maybe it's different. And interesting to note that the original classification authority is Naval Air Systems Command. Next slide, please. Oh, yes, this is interesting, I think. Shortly after the New York Times broke this story, obviously a whole bunch of people in Congress said, hey, what's going on? You always told us no one was doing UFOs, no one was investigating, and now we read this. What's happening? So you will find, again, one of the very few pieces of paperwork that we have on AATIP. I mentioned the congressional, the contractual solicitation document. We have that. We have a 2009 letter from former Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid, who was instrumental in setting up AATIP, to the Deputy Defense Secretary, arguing that AATIP should be given special access program status. And one of the other things we have is this January 9th, 2018 letter. And again, I have copies of this if anyone wants to email me offline afterwards. And I can give you the hyperlinks on government websites, etc., etc. They wrote to Congress, to specifically Armed Services Committee, Intelligence Committee, Appropriations Committee, and this quote was in there. The purpose of AATIP was to investigate foreign advanced aerospace weapon threats from the present out to the next 40 years. In other words, they were definitely trying to spin this as being an aerospace program. Next generation threats. Next slide, please. But that was the cover letter. Attached to the cover letter was a list of 38 studies. And as I mentioned, some of the authors of those studies were at the Field Propulsion Conference that Ronald and myself and others, maybe others in this room, certainly I'm sure others listening to this presentation attended. Some of those 38 studies were written by some of those same attendees. And guess how many of those 38 studies done under the AATIP contract had anything to do with Russian aircraft, Chinese factory capacity, North Korean or Iranian political intentions? Zero. They were all, as you know, about advanced theoretical physics concepts, anti-gravity, invisibility cloaking, stargates, warp drive, wormholes, and much more besides. A lot of it configured on the sorts of theoretical physics you would need to turn into an engineering reality. And my father was an aeronautical engineer by trade, went on to be deputy science advisor at the MOD, or chief scientific advisor, as they called it at the time. And my father would have loved this, but he would have said, that's all very well, but someone needs to build this. And by someone, he meant the aeronautical engineers. So, but you will see the list of these programs, and none of them, as I say, were anything to do with Russia or China and their aircraft, missile, or drone programs and what those might look like 40 years from now. It was all about deep space travel and the physics you'd need to get there. And the absolute giveaway, of course, was that there was a paper on the Drake equation, the theoretical Drake equation, to be precise. And as as pretty much everyone listening here knows, I mean, frankly, the only purpose, the only purpose of the Drake equation really is to estimate the number of communicable civilizations there might be in the Milky Way galaxy. And so I asked the DoD, I said, if this is really just about next generation aerospace threats, Russia, China, etc., why did part of this government funding program look at and produce a report on the Drake equation, the only purpose of which is to estimate number of civilizations there might be out there? And let's just say that I believe last Wednesday was the 1-year anniversary of my question to DoD, which remains, I believe, one of the longest unanswered questions to public affairs in history. Next, please. I mentioned that there'd been some congressional briefings, Armed Services Committee, Senate Intelligence Committee. This is a phrase from somebody who took the brief. Yes, we've been briefed, but it's classified. I'm not getting into it. Next, please. Again, a very similar program, a very similar comment from Vice Chair of Senate Intelligence Committee. Yeah, I'm not getting into it. It's classified. Next, please. The president has been briefed too. He confirmed that he attended a short meeting on all this. In the first of his quotes that I put up there, he did say that, yeah, some of them really see things that are a little bit different than in the past. We're watching and you'll be the first to know. Probably not. He's given some other comments since then, very intriguing, teasing Father's Day interview with his son that he did, where he said he knows some interesting things, but he'd have to think long and hard about declassifying any of it. He commented on the Navy videos again, or one of them. He said that's a heck of a video, and who knows, maybe it's real. If he does have something, if he does know some greater truth about this, well, I guess he's only got a few days to reveal it. I suppose it would be the ultimate legacy cementing revelation. My people of the world, you know, my fellow Americans, my people of the world, we're not alone. The ultimate monkey wrench, perhaps, for the incoming administration too. All speculation, but we'll find out soon enough. Next, please. I'm conscious we've got about 5 minutes left and then questions. So I'm going to, this is the last couple of slides, and then we'll throw this open. And my apologies, I have seen some questions and comments come up in the group chat, but I can only just about single task. I certainly can't multitask. So apologies if I haven't gotten to them or let alone replied, but hopefully we can pick them up in Q&A. This again is a still, it's not a video, but I have, I suppose, been one of the regular contributors on this story as it has unfolded. I think I've done 12 interviews with Tucker Carlson, some other ones on other shows. As I mentioned, it's not a political issue. Long before Tucker Carlson was interested in this, Larry King was interested and covered it a lot on CNN, and I was a fairly regular guest on that show too. So let's not bring partisan politics into any of this. But I've done my best. I've done my best as somebody who now works as a broadcaster and journalist myself. I've done my best to keep this story in the public eye, to try to sort out some of the signal from the noise, to try to tell the story in a way that lay people will find interesting, and to try and keep it in the mainstream media spotlight. Next slide, please. This, I think, gets to the heart, and this is the last one apart from the wrap-up slide. This, I think, gets to the heart of where we are now. Last year, when the Senate Intelligence Committee drafted the Intelligence Authorization Act for fiscal year 2021, on pages 11 and 12, there was a section under the heading Advanced Aerial Threats. And it went on to mention UAP again. And it essentially said, within 180 days of enactment, we, the Senate Intelligence Committee, but also speaking for the Armed Services Committee, but someone has to take the lead, we want a report on this phenomenon from Director of National Intelligence, consulting Secretary of Defense and other agency heads and subject matter experts as required. This report must be unclassified, but can have a classified annex. And as I say, it's due within 180 days of enactment. Well, things got quite interesting. The Intelligence Authorization Act wasn't going to get through. Then the material on UAP got moved into the National Defense Authorization Act. That wasn't going to get through. And you'll recall the controversy about military bases being named after Confederate figures, for example, but that wasn't going to get through. And eventually, what happened was the Intelligence Authorization Act did get through by virtue of being tagged onto the COVID-19 relief bill, which was enacted on December 27th. So, and the version that was published did not contain the UAP material, but it was formally linked to it by virtue of a congressional note. So a lot of people have said, well, is it legally binding? Is it going to happen? This is a defense, this is a Director of National Intelligence lead. 2 weeks ago, I reached out to Office of DNI, Public Affairs, and I put this to them. And I said, are you aware of it? And are you going to do it? And the answer was yes. So this will be happening. 180 days, I think, from December 27th is going to be June 25th. Some people have speculated they might ask for an extension. I wonder whether they might actually come in early with something fairly bland, all the good stuff in the classified annex, of course, but we'll get to that when we get to it. Kamala Harris sits on the Intelligence Committee, so that's quite interesting as the Vice President-elect. One assumes, will have already been one of the people given this classified briefing. If not, she can very quickly get it. The Senate Intelligence Committee said that this report should also sweep up investigations being done by the FBI into some sightings on the continental United States. It must address all sorts of material, SIGINT, HUMINT. I heard somebody ask, I think at the tail end of Ronald's presentation, about data on all this. MASINT is a big part of all this, measurement and signature intelligence. And the government will have a lot of data. So they will have a lot of material on which to draw up a best current assessment. So I hope this short presentation has been interesting to you all in terms of where we are and perhaps a little bit of how we got here. and how those of us who look at this from within government, from a non-scientific, but from a sort of policy side of view, how we view this. So my thanks to Tim for organizing this event, and to all of you for listening. And I would be more than pleased to take any questions. Thank you very much.